At 25,000 feet over Germany, the oxygen system stopped working. The pilot knew exactly what that meant. He had maybe 90 seconds before unconsciousness. Inside the bomber, the temperature outside was nearly 60 degrees below zero. Frost crept along the inside of the aluminum skin. The thin air outside the aircraft carried only a fraction of the oxygen the human body needed to function. Without supplemental oxygen, a man did not simply feel short of breath. He lost his mind first. Judgment failed. Vision narrowed. Hands stopped responding. Within minutes, he would collapse. Within a few minutes more, the brain would begin to die. In the cockpit of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the crew was already beginning to slump at their stations. The gunner's head dipped forward. The navigator blinked slowly, struggling to stay conscious. The pilot felt his own thoughts drifting apart like pieces of paper in the wind. Somewhere behind him, the flight engineer understood exactly what was happening, and he knew there was almost no time left to fix it. The morning of November 1943 began like every other mission morning at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, England. The base came alive before sunrise. Ground crews had worked through the night, their breath visible in the cold darkness as they patched flak holes in thin aluminum skins. Mechanics replaced engines that had seized during previous missions. Fuel crews checked lines and tanks again and again, searching for leaks that could turn a bomber into a fireball halfway across Europe. The smell of aviation gasoline hung in the air. It mixed with the damp autumn fog of East Anglia and the distant smell of coal fires drifting from nearby English villages. The 100th Bombardment Group was preparing for another mission, another long flight into Germany, another gamble with mathematics and survival. The men of the 100th Bomb Group had a nickname, not an official one, not something written in reports or painted on aircraft. They called themselves the Bloody Hundredth. They had earned the name the only way such names are earned, through loss, through numbers that stopped feeling real. During the summer and autumn of 1943, the group had suffered casualties that stunned even veteran commanders. On some missions, half the aircraft dispatched never returned. Sometimes more. Replacement crews arrived at Thorpe Abbotts almost every week. Young men stepping off trucks, carrying flight bags, looking up at the rows of bombers lined across the airfield. Many of them were gone within a few missions. Those who survived long enough learned to watch for small details. Things new crews ignored. The way ice formed on control surfaces at altitude. The patterns of anti-aircraft flak bursts above certain German cities. The blind angles where German fighters preferred to attack. And increasingly, they watched something else. The oxygen system. At 25,000 feet, the air holds only about 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. Human beings are not designed to function there. Without oxygen equipment, a pilot might remain conscious for only a few minutes. Hypoxia, the medical term for oxygen deprivation, does not arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly. First comes a strange sense of calm. Sometimes even mild euphoria. Then confusion. Then mistakes. A pilot might forget procedures he had practiced hundreds of times. A gunner might simply stop responding. Within minutes, the crew would lose consciousness. And without oxygen, death followed soon after. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried a complex oxygen distribution system. Liquid oxygen stored in tanks was converted into gas. That gas flowed through regulators and rubber hoses to each crew position. Every man wore an oxygen mask connected to the system. On paper, the design worked beautifully. In reality, it failed far too often. Rubber hoses froze in extreme cold. Regulators malfunctioned. Masks leaked. Moisture from a crewman's breath condensed inside the equipment and turned to ice. Sometimes the oxygen simply stopped flowing. And when it did, there was no warning. The crews had a name for it. The invisible killer. Flak could be seen. Enemy fighters could be seen. But hypoxia crept up silently. A man might not realize anything was wrong until he was already losing consciousness. Outside the briefing hut, the engines of the bombers began to start. The right R-1820 Cyclone engines coughed once, twice, then roared to life. One after another, the aircraft woke. The sound filled the cold air. Deep, vibrating, mechanical thunder. Inside the briefing building, crews sat on narrow wooden benches. No one talked much. They waited. At the front of the room hung a large map of Europe covered by a curtain. Behind that curtain ran a red ribbon. It showed the route they would fly. When the curtain was pulled back, every man in the room would know exactly how dangerous the mission would be and how far they would have to go without fighter escort. When the curtain finally moved, the red ribbon stretched deep into Germany. Very deep. A long silence followed. Every man in the room understood what it meant. Technical Sergeant Walter J. Corliss grew up far from war. He came from the flat farmland of Nebraska, where the horizon stretched endlessly and machinery was part of everyday life. His father repaired tractors and harvesting equipment for neighboring farms during the Depression. Money was scarce, but broken machines were everywhere, and broken machines meant work. Young Walter spent his childhood watching engines being taken apart and rebuilt. He learned something simple. Every machine followed logic. Every problem had a cause. And if you understood how the system worked, you could fix almost anything. School bored him. Books moved too slowly. But give him an engine or a gearbox, and he could understand it instantly. His hands learned what his teachers could not explain. He thought in systems, in connections, in the way one small component could affect an entire machine. When war came, Corliss joined the Army Air Forces. He wanted to fly, but his education disqualified him from pilot training. Instead, he trained as a flight engineer. At first, it felt like a disappointment. Soon it became clear it was the perfect role. Flight engineers occupied an unusual place inside a bomber crew. They were enlisted men, not officers, but they often understood the aircraft better than anyone else on board. A good engineer could diagnose problems just by listening to the engines. He managed fuel consumption, controlled engine power settings, monitored electrical systems, and kept the aircraft alive when logic said it should have fallen from the sky. Corliss joined the 100th Bomb Group in the summer of 1943. His pilot was Second Lieutenant Harold Stockton, a quiet man from Ohio who spoke little and listened carefully. Stockton had one quality that separated good pilots from bad ones. He trusted his crew, especially his engineer. Their early missions were overwhelming. Nothing in training prepared a man for combat at high altitude. The cold that crept through every layer of clothing. The constant roar of engines that made conversation impossible. The violent bursts of German anti-aircraft flak, black clouds exploding around the bomber formation. And the fighters, German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs appearing suddenly, guns flashing, then disappearing before anyone could react. Corliss survived by focusing on his job. When fear crept in, he watched his instruments. Engine temperatures, fuel levels, oil pressure. Numbers were steady. Numbers made sense. Numbers kept panic away. But over time, he began to notice patterns. Patterns in how bombers were lost. Aircraft that simply drifted out of formation. Bombers that began slow spirals toward the ground without visible damage. Crews found dead in their seats. No wounds. No signs of battle. Just silence. Corliss suspected something many others ignored. The oxygen system. After every mission, he studied reports. He talked to crew chiefs. He examined the oxygen equipment itself. Tracing hoses. Studying regulators. Looking for weak points. The system worked well under laboratory conditions, but it was never designed for combat. It was never designed for temperatures that froze metal, for aircraft shaking violently from flak bursts, for hoses that iced over at 25,000 feet. So Corliss began preparing. Quietly, without telling anyone. He started carrying spare hose sections, small pieces of tubing, rubber bands, wire, tiny tools tucked into the pockets of his flight suit. The other crewmen laughed. They called him paranoid. Corliss didn't argue, because he understood something simple. The difference between paranoia and preparation is whether the thing you fear actually happens. And in the autumn of 1943, oxygen failures were happening more often than anyone wanted to admit. Inside the 8th Air Force, medical officers were quietly tracking the problem. Official reports blamed most losses on fighters, flak, or structural failure. But hidden inside those statistics was another cause. Oxygen system malfunctions. Sometimes the failure killed crews directly. Other times it knocked them unconscious, leaving the bomber defenseless. A drifting aircraft became easy prey for German fighters. Or it simply fell out of formation and vanished. No one knew exactly how many crews were lost this way, but the internal reports suggested something disturbing. The oxygen system, the equipment meant to keep men alive, was often the weakest link in the entire bomber. And on a cold morning in November 1943, That weakness was about to threaten 10 men at 25,000 feet over Germany. Ground crews did everything they could to keep the bombers flying, but they were drowning in work. Aircraft returned from Germany riddled with flak holes, engines damaged, control surfaces bent, hydraulic lines severed. Repair crews worked through the night just to make the next day's missions possible. There was never enough time, never enough hands, never enough understanding of what truly happened to complex systems at 25,000 feet in combat. Oxygen equipment was checked, masks were inspected, regulators were tested, but rarely under the brutal conditions the crews actually faced: freezing temperatures, violent vibration, combat damage, and the relentless cold of the upper atmosphere. The system looked fine on the ground. Up in the sky, it sometimes failed silently. The flight surgeons knew about the danger. They warned crews constantly about hypoxia. They taught them the symptoms: euphoria, confusion, tunnel vision, loss of coordination. Men were told to watch each other. If someone began acting strangely, the crew was supposed to intervene immediately. But there was a flaw in that advice. It only worked if the crew remained conscious long enough to help each other. Several attempts were made to improve the system. New mask designs were tested. Different oxygen regulators were evaluated. Some depots experimented with modified equipment. But wartime logistics moved slowly, and the bombers were flying missions every day. The improved equipment never reached operational units fast enough to solve the immediate problem. So the crews adapted. Some carried extra walk-around oxygen bottles and checked them obsessively. Others built crude backup connections from spare parts scavenged from supply depots. And some crews simply accepted the risk. Because in war, some problems had no immediate solution. Walter Corliss approached the problem differently. He treated it like an engine failure, a system failure, something mechanical that could be understood and possibly fixed. He began mapping the entire oxygen system on his aircraft. Every hose, every regulator, every connection. He traced the lines through the fuselage until he could picture the entire system in his head. He studied where failures could occur, where ice might form, where combat damage might break the flow. Then he ran a calculation. At 25,000 feet, hypoxia could incapacitate a man in about 90 seconds. Not long enough to diagnose a complex failure. Barely long enough to think clearly. That meant troubleshooting was impossible. The response had to be instant. Pre-planned. Rehearsed. Automatic. The crew needed to know exactly what to do before the system failed. Corliss explained his idea to Lieutenant Harold Stockton. The pilot listened quietly. Stockton had flown enough missions to know preparation saved lives. He approved the plan immediately. What Corliss built next never appeared in any official technical manual. It was a field invention, a solution born from necessity. He called it the bypass kit. The kit was simple: a small canvas bag filled with tubing, clamps, connectors, and fittings. Nothing complicated. Just enough equipment to connect directly to the emergency oxygen bottles and bypass the aircraft's regulator system entirely. If the main oxygen system failed, the crew could connect their masks directly to these bottles. It was crude, but it might keep them alive. Corliss placed the kit within arm's reach. He trained the crew to use it. They practiced assembling the system in freezing weather on the airfield. They practiced while wearing thick gloves that made their fingers clumsy. They practiced against a stopwatch. 90 seconds. That was the time limit. If they couldn't assemble the bypass system before the clock ran out, they would already be unconscious. Some of the crew joked about it. Others rolled their eyes. Corliss didn't mind. He had learned something growing up on a Nebraska farm. Sometimes survival depended on details other people ignored. On November 18, 1943, the 100th Bomb Group received orders for a mission deep into western Germany. Another long flight. Another dangerous target. Corliss checked the bypass kit before climbing aboard the bomber. It had become routine, a habit. But that morning, the canvas bag would become the most important object in the aircraft. The bombers lifted off from Thorpe Abbotts one by one, heavy with fuel and bombs, slowly climbing into the gray morning sky. Over the English Channel, the formation assembled. Aircraft arranged themselves into the combat box formation, designed to concentrate defensive firepower against attacking fighters. Corliss watched the engine instruments. Oil pressure steady. Cylinder head temperature stable. Fuel flow normal. The aircraft was healthy. At 10,000 feet, the crew switched to oxygen. Each man connected his mask. One by one, they reported over the interphone. Navigator on oxygen. Bombardier on oxygen. Top turret on oxygen. Routine. Automatic. A ritual repeated on every mission. France passed beneath them. Then Germany. The flak began. Black bursts appeared around the formation. Anti-aircraft guns fired from the ground far below. The explosions seemed random. But the gunners knew exactly where the bombers were going and where they would be. The formation climbed higher. 15,000 feet. 20,000 feet. Then 25,000 feet. Outside, the temperature dropped to nearly -60 degrees. The sky turned dark blue. The ground below became distant and abstract. The world felt very far away. German fighters appeared soon after. Small shapes in the distance. Then suddenly much closer. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving through the formation. The gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked through the thin air. One bomber off the left wing took hits. Smoke poured from an engine. Another aircraft drifted downward. Tiny figures began falling from it. Parachutes. Corliss kept watching his instruments. Waiting. Listening. The failure came suddenly. Without warning. At first it was subtle. A slight dizziness. A strange feeling that his thoughts were slowing down. Corliss recognized the sensation immediately. Hypoxia. He checked his oxygen regulator. The gauge showed pressure. But the system wasn't responding to his breathing. He inhaled sharply. Nothing. The oxygen wasn't flowing. His hands moved faster now. He grabbed the walk-around oxygen bottle and connected it to his mask. Pure oxygen flooded his lungs. His mind cleared slightly. But he knew the bottle held only about 10 minutes of supply. Not nearly enough to finish the mission, or even reach England. He looked around the aircraft. And the situation was worse than he expected. The bombardier had slumped over his bomb sight. The navigator moved slowly, clearly confused. One of the waist gunners had collapsed completely. The entire oxygen system had failed. Not just his regulator. The main supply line. Corliss understood what had happened. Somewhere inside the aircraft, a flak fragment had probably punctured the oxygen line. The system was bleeding pressure. The crew was suffocating. Quietly. Silently. At their stations. He had about 90 seconds. After that, hypoxia would claim him too. Once he lost consciousness, the bomber would continue flying. Until it ran out of fuel. Or drifted out of formation. Or fell from the sky. 10 men would die without ever knowing why. Corliss grabbed the bypass kit. His gloves made his fingers clumsy. His vision was beginning to narrow. But he had practiced this. Again, and again, and again. He pulled out the tubing. The connectors. The clamps. He connected a line to his oxygen bottle. Then ran the tube toward the bombardier station. A crude junction allowed 2 men to share one supply. The bombardier stirred. Corliss shouted through the mask. Hold the line. He grabbed another bottle. Connected it to the navigator. The man's eyes slowly refocused. Breathing returned. But there were still more crewmen to reach. Corliss moved through the aircraft. Fighting the fog creeping into his mind. Working by touch as much as sight. The waist gunner had a pulse. Barely. Corliss connected him to another shared oxygen line. Nearby, the radio operator had begun helping. He saw what Corliss was doing and started building additional connections using spare tubing from the kit. Up front, Lieutenant Stockton realized something was wrong. He pushed the bomber into a descent, dropping from 25,000 feet down to 18,000. Lower altitude meant thicker air, more oxygen, but the maneuver carried risks. Leaving the formation made the aircraft vulnerable to fighters and dangerously close to other bombers. Still, it bought time. Time Corliss desperately needed. Then he found the real problem. Behind the bomb bay, a section of oxygen line had been punctured, probably by flak. The line wasn't completely severed, but oxygen was escaping faster than the system could replace it. The pressure was collapsing. Corliss clamped the damaged section. The leak slowed. Then he connected a bypass tube around the break, routing oxygen through intact sections of the system. The repair was crude. Wire, clamps, improvised tubing. But slowly, the pressure stabilized. One by one, voices returned over the interphone. Oxygen flowing. Navigator back on oxygen. Waist gunner okay. The crew was alive. And the bomber kept flying. The men who had been unconscious slowly began to revive. At first they were confused. Their movements were sluggish. But they were breathing. Alive. Corliss moved through the bomber checking each connection, tightening clamps, adjusting oxygen flow where it was weakest. Only after the last crew member responded did he finally allow himself to breathe normally again. The entire crisis had lasted less than 4 minutes. To the men inside the aircraft, it had felt like hours. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Stockton watched his instruments carefully. Once the crew confirmed oxygen flow had stabilized, he gradually climbed back toward formation altitude. Breaking formation too long meant danger. German fighters hunted stragglers. Bombers flying alone rarely survived. Stockton guided the aircraft carefully upward and slid back into a gap in the bomber box. From outside, nothing appeared unusual. Just another B-17 among dozens of others crossing German skies. The mission continued. The crew reached the target. Bomb bay doors opened. The bombardier, now fully conscious again, leaned into his bomb sight and guided the aircraft across the release point. The bombs fell away. Another industrial complex inside the Reich erupted into explosions and smoke far below. Then the formation turned west, toward England, toward home. No one talked about the oxygen failure over the interphone. There was no need. Each man understood exactly how close they had come. The silence said everything. They landed at Thorpe Abbotts in the fading light of a November evening. The debriefing followed the usual routine. Bomb accuracy, enemy fighter activity, flak concentration, aircraft losses. Corliss reported the oxygen system failure and the improvised repair. The intelligence officer wrote it down, asked a few questions, and moved on to the next crew. But one man paid closer attention. The flight surgeon, Major Harold Worthington. Worthington had been quietly tracking oxygen-related incidents across the 8th Air Force. He suspected the problem was larger than official reports suggested. When he heard Corliss's explanation, he asked to see the aircraft. The two men walked across the darkening airfield. Ground crews were already working on the bomber, replacing damaged panels, inspecting engines, patching holes left by flak fragments. But Worthington was interested in something else entirely. The oxygen system. Corliss showed him everything. The damaged oxygen line behind the bomb bay, the clamps sealing the leak, the improvised bypass tubing, the connectors running between oxygen bottles, and finally the small canvas bag, the bypass kit. Corliss explained how he had planned the system, the 90-second time limit, the practice drills, the calculations he had made about oxygen supply and altitude. Worthington listened carefully. When Corliss finished, the surgeon asked a simple question. Can we teach other crews to do this? Over the next several days, Corliss worked with the base maintenance officer. Together, they refined the design. The kit was simplified. The components standardized. Written instructions were created. Training procedures were developed. The entire system could be assembled using equipment already available in supply depots. Any crew could learn it in a few hours. No aircraft modification was required. Worthington sent the documentation to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Along with it, he included his own report. He described the rising number of oxygen-related casualties, and he recommended that the bypass kit be issued across the command. The response was not immediate. Large organizations rarely move quickly, especially during wartime. But the report circulated. Maintenance officers studied it. Flight surgeons reviewed the data. Technical staff examined the design. Eventually, the idea moved forward. In January 1944, 8th Air Force issued a technical order authorizing the creation and distribution of emergency oxygen bypass kits for heavy bomber crews. The instructions were based on Corliss's design, improved through testing, standardized for wider use. The order did not mention his name. It didn't matter. The goal was not recognition. The goal was survival. Across England, bomber crews received the kits. Some were skeptical. Another headquarters directive. Another piece of equipment to carry. Others understood immediately. They had seen oxygen failures themselves, or lost friends to the invisible killer. Gradually, the kits became standard equipment aboard heavy bombers. The impact was difficult to measure. Successful rescues rarely appear in statistics. They show up only as missing casualties. Aircraft that returned when they otherwise would have been lost. Crews that landed alive instead of being found dead at their stations. But the flight surgeons noticed something. In the months following the kit's introduction, the number of unexplained crew losses began to drop. Bombers that drifted from formation now stayed in place. Crews that would have suffocated returned home. Corliss continued flying. He completed 27 additional missions with the 100th Bomb Group. The oxygen system failed again once completely. several other times partially. Each time, the bypass kit worked. Each time, the crew survived. He received the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. There was no specific citation for the bypass kit. It was simply part of the quiet work that kept men alive long enough to finish the war. When the war ended, the B-17s were gradually scrapped. Airfields returned to farmland. The oxygen systems that once threatened thousands of lives became technical footnotes in aviation history. But the lesson remained. Field improvisation could solve problems that official systems sometimes overlooked. The post-war U.S. Air Force absorbed many of these lessons. Flight engineers gained greater authority over aircraft systems. Emergency procedures were rewritten to reflect real combat failures. And equipment designers began consulting operational crews more directly. The gap between engineering theory and combat reality narrowed, though it never disappeared entirely. Walter Corliss returned to Nebraska. He married, raised a family, spent his life repairing farm machinery, much as his father had before him. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about his crew, about the trust that forms when 10 men share an aircraft at the edge of survival. In his garage, he kept one small object, the original oxygen bypass kit. Just tubing, clamps, a few connectors, nothing that looked remarkable to anyone who didn't know its story. But to the men who had been aboard that B-17 over Germany, it meant the difference between life and death. The 100th Bombardment Group lost 229 aircraft and more than 1,800 men during the war. Yet it continued flying until Germany surrendered. Its history is filled with stories of bravery. Pilots bringing crippled bombers home. Gunners defending aircraft against impossible odds. Engineers keeping machines alive under unimaginable stress. Among those stories is one quieter moment. Not a dogfight, not a bombing run, just a flight engineer with 90 seconds to think, and the knowledge that a broken piece of tubing could save 10 lives. In the official histories of the air war over Europe, the oxygen bypass kit appears only briefly. A technical note, a small modification mentioned in maintenance documents. Compared to bombing campaigns, fighter battles, and the massive destruction of industrial targets, it seems insignificant. Just tubing, clamps, a few improvised connectors. But to the men whose lives depended on it, the bypass kit was not a minor detail. It was the reason they survived long enough to grow old. Technical Sergeant Walter Corliss returned to Nebraska after the war ended. He resumed the life he had known before the conflict, repairing machinery, maintaining farm equipment, solving mechanical problems the same way he always had. Quietly, methodically, he married, raised children, worked long days in fields and workshops. To his neighbors, he was simply a farmer. To his family, he was a man who could fix almost anything. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about the men he flew with, about the cold inside the aircraft, about the noise, about the long missions over Germany. He never mentioned the oxygen bypass kit. To him, it had simply been a problem that needed solving, and he had solved it. When Corliss died in 1997, his funeral reflected the modest life he had lived. The pastor mentioned his military service, his Air Medal, his 28 missions over Germany, his honorable discharge from the Army Air Forces. But there was no mention of the bypass kit, no mention of the lives it had saved. The pastor did not know about it. Neither did most of the people attending the service. The kit itself was discovered later. It sat in Corliss's garage among tools, spare parts, and half-finished mechanical projects. Just another collection of fittings and tubing. His son recognized that it must have been something from the war, but he didn't know what it meant. Eventually, he donated it to a local veterans organization. For years, it remained there. Unremarkable, unexplained. Another artifact from a war that seemed increasingly distant. The story resurfaced years later through research. A historian studying 8th Air Force medical procedures came across references to Technical Order 43-17, the directive that introduced emergency oxygen bypass kits to bomber crews. Curious about the origin of the order, the historian began tracing the documentation backward. The trail led to November 1943, to Thorpe Abbotts, to the 100th Bomb Group, and eventually to a report written by a flight surgeon. In the margin of that report appeared a brief note, a reference to a technical sergeant's field improvisation. The historian began contacting surviving members of the 100th Bomb Group. By then, they were elderly men scattered across the United States. Many had not spoken about those missions for decades, but some remembered. One of them had been the radio operator on Corliss's aircraft. He remembered the day clearly. The moment the oxygen stopped flowing, the fog creeping into his thoughts, the terrifying realization that he could not think clearly enough to help himself. And then, Corliss moving through the aircraft, working with tubes and clamps, building something in midair. He remembered the exact moment the oxygen returned. The moment his thoughts snapped back into focus. The moment he realized he was still alive. But he remembered something else as well. After the mission, when the crew gathered beside their battered bomber, someone asked Corliss how he had known what to do. Corliss shrugged and said something simple, something that stayed with the radio operator for the rest of his life. He said, "The system will fail. It's built to fail. Your job isn't to trust it. Your job is to be ready when it breaks." That philosophy captured something essential about the men who survived the air war over Europe. They did not survive because their equipment was perfect, or because the system protected them. They survived because they expected failure and prepared for it. This was not cynicism. It was realism. Every machine built by humans contains human limitations, human oversight, human mistakes. The men who recognized those limits and prepared for them were the men who often made it home. The bypass kit never appeared in casualty statistics. It did not show up in official victory counts, because the lives it saved appeared only as absences. Aircraft that returned instead of crashing. Crews that survived instead of dying silently at their stations. But those absences mattered. They changed lives. And those lives changed the world that followed. The radio operator who survived that November mission later became an engineer. He spent his career designing safety systems for industrial machinery. Whenever he trained young engineers, he repeated the lesson he learned at 25,000 feet. Prepare for the emergency. Because the emergency you prepare for is the emergency you survive. The bombardier, who had collapsed over his bomb site and woken to find oxygen flowing again, became a physician. He specialized in high-altitude medicine. For decades, he studied how the human body reacts to oxygen deprivation. His research helped improve safety protocols in aviation and mountaineering. The navigator, who had drifted toward unconsciousness in that frozen sky, became a teacher. For 40 years, he stood in classrooms explaining history to students who could hardly imagine the world he had seen. A world where life could disappear in 90 seconds. All of those lives, and the lives they touched, can be traced back to a moment inside a bomber over Germany. A moment when a flight engineer refused to accept that a failed system meant certain death. The bypass kit itself was nothing extraordinary. Just tubing, clamps, simple connectors. But it represented something powerful. The ability of human intelligence to recognize danger and adapt. To solve problems when systems fail. To act when there is no time to wait for instructions. That ability is not automatic. It requires observation, preparation, practice, and the willingness to see risks others ignore. Walter Corliss possessed that ability. He had learned it as a farm boy fixing broken machinery. Machines fail. Systems break. The solution is not panic. The solution is preparation. At 25,000 feet over Germany, in air too thin to breathe and cold enough to freeze metal, that lesson saved 10 men. In a few desperate minutes, Corliss built a solution that would outlive the war. The men he saved carried that lesson forward. Into families, into careers, into decades of life that would never have existed otherwise. The system failed, and one man was ready when it did. That is sometimes all it takes to change history.